Well, hello. Welcome to this afternoon. We have a discussion about fair and sustainable collaborations. My name is Anne Fleckstein. I am in charge of the Turn 2 program and formerly known as the Turn program of the German Federal Culture Foundation, which is a program that funds artistic collaborations between Germany and African countries. I'm here on the panel today with Yasmine Ostendorf and Mike van Graan. Welcome. Yasmine is joining us from Brazil and Mike is joining us from South Africa. So we're really intercontinental today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce both of them to you just so that you have an idea who is actually speaking on this panel, what our topics are and have been, and then we'll both of them are going to make a short introduction about aspects that define their work and in how far they have been dealing with the issue of sustainable and fair collaborations in their work. And then we can hit it off in an open conversation, the three of us. But you can also join, of course. You can ask questions via Slido, and please make sure to address the question to our discussion. So either address it to Anne, Yasmine, or Mike, so that we know you would like to talk to us. Yeah, I'm going to start with Yasmine. Yasmine Ostendorf is a researcher and curator, and she runs the Green Art Lab Alliance, which is a network of 45 cultural organizations in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. And this alliance proposes alternative ways of living and working that ultimately shape more sustainable, interconnected, and resilient communities. She has worked extensively on international cultural mobility programs and on the topic of art and ecology, and has been an expert in numerous contexts, among others, Julie's Bicycle in the UK, Bamboo Curtain Studio in Taiwan, Cape Farewell in the UK as well, Lab Verde in Brazil, and Trans Artist in the Netherlands. She's also the author of the series Creative Responses to Sustainability, which is published by the Asia Europe Foundation Singapore and the Ecologic Institute in Germany. And she's also a fellow at the Salzburg Global Forum in Austria and the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Germany. She works as an associate curator for Valley of the Possible in Chile and for Sea Platform in China. And she's the founder of the Nature Research Department at the Jan van Eyck Academy in the Netherlands, the Jan van Eyck Food Lab, and the Future Materials Bank. And if this doesn't already blow your mind, you know, she's also been organizing food art film festivals, showcasing innovative and sustainable food art practices. And this is also something I think she's very active in right now. She just told us she's been harvesting shiitake the whole day. And she's currently based at a food forest and mushroom farm in Minas Gerais. I'm not quite sure whether I'm pronouncing this right, in Brazil, and where she's developing her latest research on mycelium as methodology, using a mycological lens to develop sustainable models of collaboration and also exchange in the context of the post-pandemic. So this is an extremely original approach to collaboration, I find. Now, on the other side of the globe, we'll have Mike van Graan joining us, who's also someone blowing your mind, well, blowing my mind, I can say. He's a very well-known, renowned playwright and cultural activist, and whose work has been dealing with post-apartheid conditions, but also with international topics focusing on inequality and its human consequences. He's the coordinator of the Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation, STAND, which was launched by individuals within the dance and performing arts theater sector to support those who make their livelihoods within the sector. And he also helps to program and facilitates the Atelier for Festival Managers, hosted by the Brussels-based Festival Academy that most of you surely know. He's been in numerous functions as a political advisor in cultural policy. Among others, he was the Secretary General of the National Arts Coalition in the early 90s, where he was also appointed as an advisor to the First Minister of Arts and Culture in post-apartheid South Africa, where he played an extremely important role in shaping post-apartheid cultural policies. He was also the founding Secretary General of the Ethereal Network, a Pan-African civil society network, advancing Africa's creative sector and its contribution to human rights, advocacy, and development. And from 2011 to 2018, he served on UNESCO's expert facility on the 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression. He is the recipient in 2018 of the Hiroshima Prize for Peace and Culture. And the same year, he was also awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Pretoria. So I'm extremely humbled and honored to welcome both of you to this panel. And I think already from hearing and listening to your CV, we got an idea on how many levels and in how many ways you are involved in the connection of fair and sustainable collaborations. I would like to ask Yasmine to start by giving us a little intro into your current work, but also into your experiences, to tell us a bit what the current situation in your experience in international artistic collaborations is, what the current questions in this field are at the moment, and then Mike will follow up on Yasmine. Please, Yasmine, go ahead.
Thank you.
Your floor.
No, and thank you so much for having me, for having us. It's really great that you're organizing this, and it's an honor to be part of this. And I think there's really not only a growing interest in this art intersection of culture and ecology, but also growing need for understanding and improving our knowledge in this field. So I hope, I'll be able to contribute to that a little bit today. So I think it would be nice to start with saying a little bit indeed about Gala, about the Alliance, because that is something that's been active, for almost a decade actually, since 2012. And basically we call it a mycelium-like alliance. So to just explain for those who are not familiar with mycelium, it's like the underground network of mushrooms. So it's the network in which species can communicate with each other and exchange resources. So how, for instance, trees can communicate with each other and warn each other, but also how different nutrients can be exchanged. I make this kind of parallel because I think it's really interesting to look at biomimicry, not only the mimicking of nature, not only in terms of objects, which mostly is the case. We look at the wings of a bird to build an aircraft, for instance, but also to think in terms of system design. So I think what we all, maybe except for a couple of billionaires, but what most people would agree on is that a lot of our systems don't serve, people, species, nature in the widest sense in an equal and fair way. And therefore we need to start rebuilding some of these systems and structures. So some of these structures, are related to colonialism, to capitalism, to patriarchy, etc. So why not look at nature to find inspiration for how we would organize this? So we currently consist of 45 organizations, like I said, 15 in Europe, 15 in Asia, 15 in Latin America. And what we try to do is be a support network, to be a knowledge alliance. So to exchange resources whenever that is needed. So sometimes it can also be more dormant. But what we found with the pandemic is actually that the interest and the needs peaked. So people, of course, were losing their audiences, they were losing their funding, they were having COVID-infected staff, etc. So there was an increased need to lean on each other, to have these interdependencies, this symbiosis between organizations. And so we organize ourselves in various different ways through partner working groups, so on different themes. For instance, water, ocean, river protection, but also ecocide. So how could you as a cultural organization represent the voice of nature in court? So really also crossing over to other disciplines, in this case law, but also crossing over to other disciplines, for instance, with indigenous communities. So looking at indigenous territories, land struggle, food sovereignty, etc. So I think also this crossover to other disciplines is really important in this, increasingly complex world in which, I really feel, especially in this Brazil context, obviously, that the apocalypse has started more or less. So there is no other way than to start depending more and more on each other and sharing these resources and building these alternative structures of support, solidarity, and exchange. I could talk about this for a long time because we do a lot of different things and we have a lot of we have a lot of different resources like mappings and like I said, this Future Materials Bank, which is an online inventory of materials for artists and designers that are biodegradable, non-toxic, or otherwise sustainable. So really giving access to knowledge, really, because in the end, I strongly feel like environmentalism is so connected to social issues, to social justice. So without recognizing social inequality, there is no environmental justice, because the starting point for everyone is different. Access to knowledge, access to resources, access to opportunities, etc. So I think this is definitely something that I would really like to address. Then, the issue of language, I think, is quite important. We talk in English. It's not everyone's native language, including myself, but still. Talking about measurability of things, I think, is important when we're talking about the context of sustainability. In a more European discourse, we often talk about technology, innovation, and environmental footprint, so reducing carbon emissions. So those are much more on the measurable side of things, while as in a more holistic approach, it also, you enter a more spiritual domain, a more holistic domain, which is also about relationship to your ancestors, to the land, etc. And then the final one, two final ones that I wanted to touch on is decision-making processes and hierarchies. Often, the funds come from one place, and then the projects are taking place somewhere else. So I think it's really interesting to also look at decision-making processes in various different movements. In Brazil, there's many interesting examples also, for instance, of how people have self-organized or have organized themselves. So I think this issue of self-organizing is becoming increasingly important. The movement of the farmers without land, the MST, loads of this kind of movements where actually there's a lot of knowledge in how you organize these things in a fair and equal, sustainable way. And then the last one that I wanted to touch upon, and then I'm very curious to hear also more from Mike, is this issue of being open source. So with the Future Sustainable, or with the Future Materials Bank, one of the key issues is that we wanted everyone to be able to upload their own projects, like showing the work of their materials. So I think this issue of, you know, who selects, who decides of what is visible or what is presented or who gets funded is very also interesting to, or important to discuss and look into. And I might leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you so much, Yasmine. Before I hand over to Mike, I just want to probably create a link for the people listening to us between the two of you. Both of you have worked closely with On the Move in Brussels, and Mike, among others, has actually written a toolkit that was also facilitated by On the Move, that was called Beyond Curiosity and Desire Towards Fairer International Collaborations in the Arts. And some of the points that you just touched are also listed in this toolkit. And in our term program, we relied heavily on this toolkit when we wrote recommendations for fairer collaborations as a base for the Turn 2 program for artistic collaborations between Germany and African countries. So this basically as an intro to your intro, Mike. The stage is yours. Please.
Yeah, well, first of all,
yeah.
So thanks very much, Anne, and thank you, Yasmine, for setting the context as well. And thank you to the organizers of this for inviting me to be part of this. I think that COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdowns, you know, on the theatre and dance sector globally and in our country as well, it's at least introduced us to the value of technology for us to be able to have these kinds of connections where we don't have to travel. We can be talking to each other and communicating and building networks across the globe using technology. So thank you to whoever created Zoom for us to be able to engage with each other today. So in terms of my opening remarks, I'm going to be talking a little bit about sustainability and how we might understand or interpret it here, as opposed to it simply being something which has an ecological dimension. So in very brief terms, sustainability as we understand it would be the capacity to continue a program, an activity, a festival or an organization indefinitely or for as long as we'd like it to. Within a broader kind of African context, quite often the policy paradigms within which we work and the funding that tends to become available to arts practitioners on our continent from international sources and from other kind of development agencies and the like tend to happen within the paradigm of sustainable or the paradigm of development, understanding that in Africa development needs to happen, and in a broader kind of way we've had to understand this notion of sustainable development. What is sustainable development? And of course you all know the classic definitions of sustainable development, which is the process through which a current generation takes care of its own needs without compromising the capacity of future generations to take care of theirs. And so what we've tended to do within Arterial Network, the organization that Anne was talking about earlier, that I served as the Secretary General for a while, was trying to understand international policy making, both cultural policy as well as broader kind of development policy, human rights policy and the like, and what its relevance was to our continent, and to interpret that from within African conditions so that we weren't simply applying international policies that might have arisen from within particular contexts like Europe, Canada, Australia and the like, and simply transpose them onto our context, but actually try to understand what it is that they actually meant. When interrogating the notion of sustainable development, so you would know that historically, when it was first defined as, in terms of the definition I gave earlier, the three major pillars of sustainable development were seen as being economic, social, and environmental and ecological. So emphasis was placed on those three dimensions in order to ensure that development is sustainable wherever it's kind of practiced. Over the last number of years, there have been organizations engaged in the cultural domain that have basically added the fourth pillar of culture. So organizations like Agenda 21, based in Barcelona, that really organizes local municipalities across the globe. They've interpreted and understood that sustainable development has to take account of culture as well, both culture in terms of its unique contribution to development itself, but also culture in terms of values, belief systems and the like that are transversal and so impact on other forms of development as well and other sectors of social development. So for us, it's kind of been understanding development and sustainable development in those terms. When looking particularly at what sustainable development means for festivals or cultural organizations and the like, we tend to look at things both externally and internally as well. And when looking at things that would impact on an organization's sustainability from an external perspective, we've tended to use what we call, as you would also know, the PESTEL plus C kind of analysis. PESTEL being the acronym for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. That makes up PESTEL, and then the plus C is the cultural dimension as well. So political factors would be things such as, is there repression? Is there suppression of freedom of expression? Economic would be, if there is an economic recession, some of the first things to go would be support for arts and culture. What does that mean then for the sustainability of our particular organizations? If you look at a social kind of dimension of sustainability, are people educated? Are people, who are we doing these things for? Are we doing it for people who have particular streams of income? Are we making it available only to those in the higher brackets of income when we are located within a society in which inequality is one of the primary features that Yasmine kind of referred to earlier as well. If you look at technology, I was earlier on saying that we are grateful for the technology to be able to do this today, but at the same time, in many places in the global south, there is the digital divide where many people do not have access to data. Data is very expensive, so they might not have access to things that are provided online. Looking at the environmental, what are some of the ecological factors with climate change and the like, and what if weather patterns change? How will this impact on festival making, people providing or having access to particular events and the like? Looking at the legal constraints that might prevail, are there laws that prevail that prevent particular things from happening within the cultural field? For example, many people work within the informal sector. Taxation may be such that many people are unable to jump through those hoops. How does that impact on the sustainability of an organization or a particular kind of festival? And then, of course, there's the plus C element, which didn't conform to the original kind of PESTEL analysis acronym. And we've included that because there are cultural dimensions, religious beliefs, the kind of social values that various communities have, which impact on whether a festival can be pursued, whether an organization has particular challenges and the like. So, for example, within a particular community, homosexuality might be frowned upon. It might be illegal in particular contexts across the African continent. What does that then mean for organizations practicing arts with people who may identify as being gay and the like? So those are the kinds of things which, for us, kind of impact on sustainability. And of course, then there's the internal elements. It's things such as, do you have the infrastructure? Do you have the leadership? Do you have the expertise? Do you have the equipment? Do you have the resources to be able to sustain yourselves? So many organizations and activities in our continent are dependent on international funding because our own governments do not support contemporary art making. So is that sustainable? It's a huge kind of factor when it comes to the sustainability of networks, of festivals, of organizations on our continent. So just by way of opening, that's kind of some reflections on sustainability, sustainable development, and what that might mean for practice in the cultural sphere on our continent. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you so much, Mike. You already sort of open up the discussion into so many directions, and both of you pointed out so clearly why fair and sustainable are actually part of the same conversation. And the first question I would like for us to basically probably discuss, once again, you already said something about it, Mike, when you said sustainability is often part of a development policy. Especially in the TURN program, we've been we've been funding projects that are always set in kind of asymmetrical power relations. And as a foundation, however, we're very much invested in climate policies, and we would like our projects and our the institutions that we fund to be more involved in sustainability policies and so on. But we always fear that when we make this sort of a condition, especially when it comes to these international collaborations, that we actually impose a discourse that is particularly perceived as a Eurocentric or European discourse, or a discourse of sort of very well saturated European countries. How would you tackle this question? Because on the one hand, we want to speak about ecology, and on the other hand, we feel this might be something that is less important than first fostering fair social conditions before we actually ask someone to use recycled paper, you know, to sort of break it down. Probably, Mike, I know that you have a sort of very, you know, adamant standpoint or perspective on these kind of issues. How would you answer this?
Well, I'm not sure that I have an adamant one. I do have a perspective which is subject to
which is great.
change. The more I learn and the more I interface with colleagues across the globe as well. But what is interesting about that question is that in a way, I've often referred to South Africa as a microcosm of the world, because it kind of reflects the kind of questions that you're talking about. Insofar as South Africa today, despite it being a democratic, non-racial society, is incredibly affected by its history, where in a sense, a white minority on the backs of a majority of indigenous Black people have grown rich. So the disparities between the rich and the poor are incredible. And in fact, over the last 27 years, they've been exacerbated. So for many people within a more privileged kind of context, things such as the environment, ecology, climate change, and the like are green issues, are important to them. For the majority of people, the struggle for survival is what is real. People, when you have a 38% unemployment rate in our country as we do, ecology is hardly the first thing that people wake up in the morning to think about. You know, there's the struggle for just to be alive. And I'm hoping I'm not sounding dramatic, but in a way, that particular struggle and the inequalities in our country are reflected globally. And in terms of what Yasmine was saying earlier, I cannot agree with her more, that climate issues to do with the climate change and the like, climate justice is fundamentally an issue of social justice. We cannot separate the ways in which we deal with mitigating climate change without addressing historical factors that contribute towards social injustice and that continue to contribute towards it. So that in the ways that we mitigate climate change, we should be careful that we are not perpetuating social injustice. And this is why it's important that these kinds of discussions happen, that they are not simply European issues or first world kind of global north issues. They are global issues. And what happens in the global north affects the global south. You know, industrialization in China and in Europe has contributed to climate change, which we in Africa are at the coalface of experiencing. And yet our contribution to climate change has been quite minimal, comparatively speaking. So for people to come and then say to us, don't engage in industrialization because of, you know, the carbon footprint that you're going to exacerbate and the like, makes people feel like, you know, we've been exploited historically in order to drive economic growth elsewhere. And now, in terms of our own development, we are basically being advised to do something different. So I think it's something which we do need to take cognizance of in how we go about dealing with these issues. We need to talk about them in more nuance. We need to talk about them with greater kind of sensitivity to the conditions that prevail across the globe, and not see it simply as. Let me maybe take an example. I think that the COVID-19 conditions are an incredibly, they're a good example of what we can expect in the future with regard to climate change. So, for example, COVID-19, the pandemic, has affected all of us globally, but who has access to the vaccines? It's essentially people in the global north who are able to be vaccinated, and as a consequence are able to travel and the like. For many people in the global south, I mean, you know, in South Africa at the moment, probably the wealthiest country on the African continent, less than 300,000 people to date have received the vaccination. And we have a population of 58 million people. So even in a country as wealthy as South Africa, access to vaccinations and the like, you know, so it kind of limits what people can do in terms of global travel and the like, and engaged in selling their labor internationally and the like. So, you know, we need to look at what are the lessons that we are able to learn from this COVID-19 pandemic period, if we are to make sure that we can address COVID-19 globally. Then everyone across the globe needs to be vaccinated and healthy in order to ensure that other people are not infected. And I think that that's going to be the same with regard to climate change. How do we ensure that everybody's interests are taken care of, so we don't look at these things in silo? Even if Germany does get it right completely and the rest of Africa doesn't, you know, Germany is always going to be under threat because of what is happening in Africa. And I think that we need to have a more global way of addressing these things, as opposed to looking at them with a more nationalistic or regional kind of perspective.
Thank you, Mark. Oh, Yasmine, you're back. You've been sort of popping out, on and out.
Yeah, the internet is a little bit unstable, unfortunately.
Well, as long as you're with us.
Yeah.
I was going to actually, you know, ask you to probably also say something about the interconnectedness between global and also local initiatives, because what Mike has been describing for South Africa, I figure that is quite applicable to Brazil and its social context as well. And I know that you're also very involved in local initiatives, and at the same time there is a huge need to sort of have the global picture in perspective, like Mike mentioned, you know, that the social injustice is very much sort of a part and a consequence of global developments. How would you sort of, or do you have either examples, or how would you sort of see this connection between global and local connections to sustainability, and also a wider and more holistic understanding of sustainability?
Yeah, and I also kind of still wanted to react on the previous question, actually, also about this kind of what could be maybe this European approach, or, you know, what do we need to do, basically. And I think one of my great lessons, having spent also a significant amount of time across Asia, comes actually from the great Confucius, which is also the issue of bring your ears and not your mouth. You know, just listen. Because if we listen what the needs are, you know, there is a lot that we can learn. And I guess that's also a little bridge to the next question. It's about that mutualism. So it needs to be going always two ways, just like how it is in the mycelium. It's never like one direction kind of traffic. I do think indeed that, you know, sustainability is definitely not about not traveling anymore and not flying anymore and not working internationally anymore. I think it's crucial that we do continue to do that. maybe not in the same way as we used to do, but that international perspective is extremely important, also because it makes more like smaller initiatives or grassroots initiatives or activist initiatives very vulnerable if they do not have this international support, if they don't have the international weight also behind them. For instance, just to give a little example to make it more concrete, like with the Alliance, we have a partner in Korea, very small, 3 females, artist-run activist collective. They were involved in a court case against their own government. There were no Korean environmental lawyers who wanted to, fight for their case, because it's not a popular case to be working against your own government. So that's when then also, the international connections come in, and access maybe to a pro bono environmental lawyer, or maybe to press, to have international attention. And suddenly when you have 45 other organizations behind you writing your letters of support, or writing your references, or writing about what you're doing, or giving visibility to what's happening in your country, you're a lot less vulnerable as an activist too. So that's something that also we need to use, that international platform can also really be a tool for safeguarding some more grassroots initiatives. And I think the other way around, it's even more kind of obvious, what we can learn from these more embedded communities and how they organize themselves, their knowledge of the land, of the locality, of the histories, ways of operating. But yeah, it definitely, we need both. And I think actually residencies play a really interesting role in this. The residency as refuge, so where the residency can go beyond just this place that you hop into for 2 weeks and you do a couple of talks, but really a residency that's much more long-term, that is can also be about healing, that might also be available for climate refugees, for political refugees. I think the future of residencies is going to be really interesting. But I'm also saying that because I'm, I guess, from the world of residencies, but still.
Thank you. One key question in international mobility is always the question of traveling, and how far this relates to, how can we deal with this in sustainability? Does this mean now that international projects cannot happen anymore? What would you say, Mike? What is your...
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity, because I think it's probably one of the easiest ways in which festivals in the global north tend to think that they can deal with this issue of the carbon footprint. And I would just like to maybe pose a couple of complexities around this. It was interesting because I think that I was a part of a Festival Academy initiative recently where some research that was done showed, and I think it was actually done by a German festival, that showed that actually the biggest contributor to the carbon footprint of a festival was the travel of the audience. So it was less the international travel that contributed to the carbon footprint than people coming to the festival. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing, just in case people were wondering about the background here, it's from a poster which I did of a play which I did some years ago about basically African mobility in the context of the contemporary world prior to COVID, and as a play called When Swallows Cry. It was about the theme of migration and so on. And one of the themes of the piece was about how that not that long ago, maybe a couple of 100 years ago, Africans were forcibly taken from the African continent, essentially to drive the economies of global north countries, Europe, America, and the like. and so forcibly taken from the continent to basically drive economic growth. And now that Africans are wanting to travel to sell their labor voluntarily on the international market, they are probably amongst the least attractive in terms of their passports and the like. I was looking at the Henley Index of passport travel, and I think among the top passports to have would be a German passport, a Japanese passport. You can get to 189 countries without needing a visa, or you can get a visa on arrival. Whereas I think the average African passport gets you to about maybe 60, 70 countries without needing a visa. And I think that, you know, in our world today, we would probably think about how bad slavery was and think, how could we even have done that? I think maybe not that long ago, not that long into the future, we're going to wonder how it is that even in today's world, you know, some people are allowed to travel as freely as they want, whereas so many other people are not allowed to travel simply on the basis of their origin, on the basis of how they look and the like. And I think that these are some of the inequalities that we need to be aware of when coming up with the knee-jerk kind of response. Let's not have international travel, you know. And I just want to, you mentioned the Sustaining Theatre and Dance, the Stan Foundation, which I coordinate. And some of the people in the audience would know Gregory Makoma, who's the chairperson of Stan Foundation. He is a fantastic choreographer, and he gave, I think, last year's international message for dance. He runs a company, the Vianney Dance Theatre Company. There are 23 people in this company, and he's been going for about 22 years, and they haven't received any funding from government at all. Many of the people whom are part of his company, the 23 Black dancers, come from quite impoverished backgrounds. Most of their funding to sustain them has come from international tours. Because of the excellence of their work, they've been able to travel internationally and the like, and they've been able to generate income that has been able to pay their dancers, who in turn have been able to support their families and so on, and lift people out of poverty. COVID-19 has basically prevented them from traveling at all in the last year, which has had a real devastating impact on their company and then on their ability to keep their people out of poverty, as it were. And they've been very creative in the way that they've found ways to keep the company going. But I'm just mentioning that as an example, because if, you know, Global North festivals and theaters do take this kind of knee-jerk response, the impact is one which is going to be quite significant in the Global South. And so it's, again, just bearing in mind the global context in which we need to be finding solutions so that what might work in a particular country or region doesn't have a negative kind of adverse effect in another.
Thank you, Mike. Very unfortunately, Yasmine is kind of dropping in and out. Apparently, the Brazilian network is not as stable. We still have 8 minutes left, and I haven't received any question via chat. So just to the listeners, if you still have some questions, just don't hesitate to ask them to us. We're happy to react in the time that we have left. I was wondering, Mike, because Yasmine mentioned sort of a very, very basic principle in, you know, when defining, or when you want to define sort of what sustainability can be on a local level and how it can connect to a global level. She said, well, you need to listen more and act less, basically, or speak less and listen more. And I remember when I first read your toolkit, that, like I said, formed the basis for our recommendation that we adopted in the term program. I felt like reading for each and every point, this was the basic message, you know, listen to each other, speak to each other and listen. It was like basic rules of communications. I was wondering, probably if you could just point out some of the aspects that you mention in your toolkit that not only are relevant to defining what can be fair in a collaboration, but also what can be a link to sustainability. I know that Yasmine, in the beginning, she mentioned language as sort of one aspect. I know that plays a huge role as well in your toolkit.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And maybe just for folk who might not be familiar with it, the context for the toolkit was, given that international collaboration takes place, And given that quite often international collaboration between global North and global South partners happens in a context where resources are brought from the global North, it creates a context of unequal power relations, a context which might not be spoken about, but which is there and which then impacts on a whole range of things, the way in which decisions are made, the way in which not only decisions about how the project develops as an organization or from an organizational form, but even aesthetically, that because the choreographer or the director is coming from the North and they're bringing the resources, people in the global South feel they don't really have a right to dictate or impact on that because, hey, at least they're getting some money to be able to pay their rent or pay for food or whatever. So it was a toolkit that kind of tried to say, look, international collaborations are fantastic and they need to continue. And we need to recognize that for historical reasons, global North does have superior resources and that there will be an element of dependence from the global South. But that doesn't mean that the way in which these collaborations take place should perpetuate inequality. There needs to be basic respect, mutual respect and understanding for each other. And I think that essentially, and I'm just aware of time, I want to make sure that Yasmine gets some time in before we close at 10:02. Basically what the toolkit calls for is for there to be a very honest and frank discussion between the partners at the very beginning, where people are placing on the table what their expectations are, what the limitations are, what they bring to the table. Some might bring resources, others might bring networks and skill. And where's the event going to happen? People in the global South might have expectations that this is going to take them abroad. People in the global North might think this is just an exotic project for now. Let's limit it to this. These things need to be spoken about at the very beginning. And then the recommendation in the toolkit is that a protocol needs to be developed so that it's all spelled out at the very beginning. And that then becomes the basis upon which the project moves forward, so that there's a basis upon which the management of any conflict that occurs during the course of the project can be managed, because you've spoken about these things before. Because, and I think I'm going to end with this, that collaborations and these kinds of international engagements need to happen on the basis of trust. They need to happen on the basis of mutual respect. And these things only happen because relationships have been built over a period of time. If you're coming in simply to do a wham, thank you, ma'am, I'm going to do a project to tick a box because I've got funding to do an international collaboration, you're going to find problems. I would really strongly suggest that in terms of international collaboration for fair trade, and just because of, we're all human within this particular world of ours, it's in our common interest to be developing relationships where we understand each other, where we respect where each other's coming from, what we are each bringing and cannot bring, and then saying, let's do this thing together in terms of what we are bringing to the table.
Hear, hear.
Yes, here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yasmine, I would love you to have the last couple of minutes. We have 2 questions on the chat, and you might want to sort of integrate this in your contribution.
Go ahead.
The one was, are there ways to support artists in Global South? Or, can you give examples how to go about if you want to start a project with artists in the Global South? And the second one is asks for literature or links that sort of can give us a vision what the next steps could be. I think when it comes to links, we can probably make a promise that we're going to post a couple of links. But to the first question, probably you want to say something as well.
Well, to both actually, because I'm a great fan of also organizing reading groups, something that I've been doing for many years, which I think is a great exercise in understanding how different people have a different reading of the same thing. And so I have like a reading list of 25 books, also indigenous leaders from Brazil and a lot of women also, obviously, that I would be really happy to share, that have been super influential anyway for me. Like, I think there's some super useful, fruitful, rich literature out there, for which I'm very grateful. I think there is also a lot of artists, you know, who are just so excited to or wanting to work on this topic outside of, well, Europe, the US, the West, wherever. And it's, yeah, I mean, very much what Mike always also was saying. It's so much about expectation management, because I think there is also, to some extent, sometimes an idealized idea of what that collaboration then might look like, so that there will be lots of funding involved and that you'll be flying all over, and it can be very disappointing also for people, because often the reality doesn't look like that. Something that we did also, and what we continuously do also with Gala, with the Alliance, is we have this co-written manifesto. So it's not only expectation management, but it's also values, I guess. So you have to have some framework in which we can say, okay, we're all going to commit to this. And then you also know where your boundaries of potential conflicts might be. And so, yeah, in terms of finding these artists, there is multiple ways. I think always going through local partners in that country is really useful. Like we said in the beginning, with ASEF, for instance, Asia Europe Foundation, we have these publication like mappings of who's doing what in different countries. And yeah, if people also are looking for something or someone specific, I'd be happy to help through also our many partnerships on this topic, because they are really the people who are then, you know, embedded in their locality. They know the artists, they know what everyone's doing. So also to, yeah, I guess to really go through them.
Well, thank you so much. We're already at the end of our discussion. I would just sort of really say big thank you to both of you. As most of you, the listeners, have probably noticed, we have the impression we're only starting this whole conversation, and also the discussion about what can sustainability mean in a more holistic understanding, and how to take political action with this kind of holistic understanding. If I may share one last point that is an experience coming from our term project, and it's a sort of very, it's a personal, but obviously also a professional experience. It's about expectation management, it's about listening, and then it's also always in questioning your own position. Even being sort of a German institution, you can be as well-meaning as you might be. You always have to sort of still be open to and question your own position. I think this is sort of a very sort of basic rule that all of you know as theater makers and artists, but I think it's a very important aspect in this whole field. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Yasmine. I just heard that we can share all the links and also contacts in the funders, which I will do. So please be assured you're not going to miss out on any information on literature or links, even if we don't post them right now. You'll get them later. Thank you.